Who authorized this detention? The governor's voice cut through the courthouse corridor, and every conversation stopped at once. Officer Grant Keller stood beneath the bronze words "Equal Justice Under Law" with one hand resting near the silver cuffs secured around the wrists of a black man in a charcoal suit. Reporters turned. Court employees froze. A young law student lowered his phone only slightly, keeping the camera pointed toward the scene. Governor Evelyn Whitmore stepped through the open doors with her security team behind her, but the room no longer felt prepared for a ceremony. It felt like a courtroom waiting for testimony. Keller straightened his shoulders. Until that moment, he had believed the situation was under control. He had stopped a man near a restricted elevator. He had questioned credentials he considered suspicious. He had ignored the court clerk who insisted that a mistake was being made. Now the governor was staring directly at him, and the confidence in his face began to disappear. "Governor, this individual attempted to enter a secured area," Keller said. His voice was firm, but not as firm as it had been minutes earlier. His access card failed, and he refused to allow a full inspection of his briefcase. The man in cuffs said nothing. He stood quietly beneath the courthouse lights, his posture straight, his expression composed. He was 56 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the steady presence of someone who had spent decades listening before speaking. He did not look toward the cameras. He did not ask the governor to defend him. He simply watched Keller explain a decision that had already begun to collapse under its own weight. Governor Whitmore looked toward the worn leather briefcase resting beside the security table. A white court seal was visible on the top document. Several pages had slipped partly from the case, including one marked Judicial Security Review. Then she turned toward Chief Marshal Rebecca Sloan, who had arrived from the West Corridor and stopped several feet away. "Marshal Sloan," the governor said, "why is this man in handcuffs?" Sloan looked first at Keller, then at the court clerk standing nearby with an identification card in her hand. Emily Carter's face was pale with disbelief. "I told him who Justice Brooks was," she said. Keller looked sharply at her. "You said he was expected upstairs. That did not verify his identity." A radio on Keller's shoulder broke the silence. The dispatcher's voice asked whether Associate Justice Adrian Brooks had entered the building. Keller reached toward the volume control, but this time everyone had already heard it. Governor Whitmore's eyes moved back to the man in cuffs. She recognized him immediately. He was not a trespasser. He was not an unidentified visitor. He was one of the highest judicial officers in the state of Franklin, standing inside his own courthouse while a room full of people tried to understand how authority had failed to recognize truth. The governor took one slow step forward. "Remove the cuffs," she said. Keller hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but the cameras captured it. So did Daniel Price, the law student who had been recording from the security line. Justice Brooks finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Do not stop recording." Daniel held the phone steady. Brooks looked past Keller toward the people lining the corridor. "Not because of who I am," he said, "but because the next man may not have a governor walking through the door." 90 minutes earlier, Associate Justice Adrian Brooks stood alone in the kitchen of his brick townhouse, watching pale morning lights spread across the hardwood floor. The temperature outside was 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and a thin spring rain tapped against the windows with the patience of a clock. On the table beside his untouched coffee rested a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to his father, a public school principal who believed that dignity revealed itself most clearly when no one powerful was present to reward it. Inside the briefcase was the final draft of the Judicial Security Review, an 18-month investigation into how citizens were treated inside courthouses across the state of Franklin. The report contained witness statements, security logs, complaint summaries, and recommendations that could change how officers were trained, supervised, and held accountable. Adrian had read every page. Some stories were dramatic. Most were not. They involved ordinary people delayed without explanation, questioned more harshly than others, or described as uncooperative after asking simple questions. The incidents rarely reached a courtroom. They disappeared into administrative language that made personal choices sound like unavoidable procedure. Miscommunication, security concern, failure to comply. Adrian had learned that injustice often survived by choosing quieter words for itself. That morning, Governor Evelyn Whitmore planned to announce a statewide courthouse reform initiative in the ceremonial chamber. Adrian was expected to arrive through the secured garage with a court driver and an escort from the Marshal Service. Instead, he called Emily Carter and told her he would enter through the public doors. He wanted to observe the system as an ordinary visitor would experience it, without robes, assistance, or advance notice clearing the path before him. Emily objected. A software update had been installed overnight, several access credentials were still being restored, and the governor's visit had placed every security unit on heightened alert. Adrian listened carefully, thanked her, and said he would see her inside. Before leaving, he opened the briefcase once more. Near the center of the report was a section describing repeated complaints linked to the same courthouse officer. The name was Grant Keller. The evidence did not yet prove misconduct in every case, and Adrian had insisted that the report avoid careless conclusions. Fairness had to apply even when suspicion pointed toward someone with authority. Still, the pattern demanded independent review. Adrian closed the case, fastened both brass latches, and placed his telephone on silent for the morning ceremony. He drove his own dark blue sedan toward downtown Franklin, where traffic slowed behind news vans, state vehicles, and temporary barricades. With the garage entrance blocked by arriving officials, he parked in a public structure nearly half a mile away and continued on foot. The rain had stopped, but the pavement remained, dark and reflective beneath the gray sky. Ahead, the courthouse rose above the street with white columns, broad stone steps, and bronze doors designed to make the law appear permanent. Adrian paused at the bottom of the staircase. For nearly 30 years, he had entered rooms where people studied his skin before they considered his credentials. He had never allowed their assumptions to determine his posture. Carrying the old briefcase at his side, he climbed toward the public entrance, unaware that Officer Grant Keller was already inside, deciding who looked as though they belonged. Inside the courthouse, Officer Grant Keller had already decided that heightened security meant fewer questions and faster judgments. He stood beside the main screening station with his uniform pressed sharply, his radio clipped high on his shoulder, and his expression fixed in the hard certainty of a man who believed experience had made him impossible to fool. At 43, Keller had spent nearly 17 years working courthouse security. He knew the building, the judges, the staff entrances, and the daily rhythm of lawyers rushing through metal detectors with coffee in one hand and case files in the other. What he did not know, or no longer cared to examine, was how differently he treated people before they gave him a reason. A white state official arrived with a credential that would not scan, and Keller politely called an assistant to confirm the man's appointment. 2 minutes later, Daniel Price stepped forward carrying a law school backpack, and Keller ordered him to open every compartment. Daniel was 24, black, and in his final year at Franklin State College of Law. He had been invited to observe the governor's announcement as part of a judicial fellowship program, but Keller studied him as though the invitation itself required proof. Daniel unzipped the bag and placed a constitutional law textbook, 2 notebooks, and a sealed bottle of water on the table. "What is your business here?" Keller asked. "I am attending the reform announcement," Daniel replied. "Invitation?" Daniel handed him the printed pass. Keller read it twice, then looked at Daniel again. "This does not give you access to restricted areas." "I did not ask for restricted access." Keller's mouth tightened. "Then do not make this difficult." Daniel said nothing. He had learned that calm answers were sometimes interpreted as attitude when the person asking had already chosen a story. A few feet away, Chief Marshal Rebecca Sloan watched the exchange while reviewing the morning security schedule. Sloan had supervised Keller for 5 years and had warned him more than once that authority did not replace judgment. She stepped closer and returned Daniel's pass herself. "He is cleared for the public gallery," she said. Then she turned to Keller. "Verify first. Decide second." Keller gave a short nod, but irritation remained in his eyes. "I know how to identify a problem." Sloan held his gaze. "That is exactly what concerns me." She moved toward the west corridor, where staff members were preparing for the governor's arrival. Daniel gathered his belongings and quietly activated the camera on his telephone before slipping it into the open pocket of his jacket. He did not know why he did it. Maybe it was Keller's tone. Maybe it was the difference between how questions were asked and how accusations were implied. Maybe some instinct told him that authority showed its truest face when it believed no important witness was present. Then the bronze doors opened, and Associate Justice Adrian Brooks entered carrying a worn leather briefcase. He paused to hold the door for an elderly woman, helped her lift a folder that had slipped from her arms, and thanked the security attendant before joining the public line. Keller looked up from the screening table. He saw a black man in a charcoal suit approaching the judicial elevator without an escort, and before Adrian reached the access reader, Keller had already decided what he was looking at. Adrian stepped toward the access reader beside the judicial elevator and placed his credential against the sensor. A red light flashed. He waited a moment and tried again. The same red light appeared, followed by a soft electronic tone. Before he could reach for his telephone, Keller left the screening station and crossed the lobby with deliberate speed. "Step away from the elevator," he said. Adrian turned calmly. "The system appears to be rejecting my credential. The clerk's office can confirm my access." Keller stopped several feet in front of him and looked from the charcoal suit to the worn leather briefcase. "That elevator is restricted to judges and authorized staff." "I am aware." Adrian removed a leather identification holder from the inside pocket of his jacket and opened it so the state seal, photograph, and title were visible. Associate Justice Adrian Brooks, Franklin Supreme Court. Keller took the credential, but instead of reading it carefully, he studied Adrian's face. "Where did you get this?" "It was issued by the court." "That is not what I asked." The lobby continued moving around them, but the movement had begun to slow. A court employee paused near the stairs. A reporter lowered her coffee. Daniel remained beside the public screening area, his telephone positioned so the camera could see the elevator corridor. Adrian kept his hands visible and his voice even. "You can verify the credential through the chief clerk or Chief Marshal Sloan." Keller turned the identification over, searching for some sign that confirmed the suspicion he had formed before the conversation began. "This card is not opening the elevator. The access system was updated overnight." Convenient explanation. Adrian held his gaze. It is also an easily verified explanation. The calm answer seemed to irritate Keller more than anger would have. He was accustomed to nervous apologies, raised voices, and people stepping backward when he moved closer. Adrian did none of those things. He stood still with the quiet patience of a man who understood that every additional second was becoming a record of Keller's choices. A side door opened, and Emily Carter hurried into the lobby carrying a folder and a tablet. Relief crossed her face when she saw Adrian. "Justice Brooks, we have been trying to locate you. Your access profile was not restored after the update." Keller raised one hand before she reached them. "Stay back." Emily stopped in disbelief. "Officer, this is Associate Justice Brooks. I am conducting a security check. You are holding his official identification." Keller glanced at her staff badge. "And you are interfering with the process." Emily's expression hardened. "Call the chief clerk. Call Marshal Sloan. Check the judicial directory on the terminal beside you." Keller ignored her and looked toward the briefcase. "Place that on the screening table and open it." Adrian did not move. "The case contains sealed court records." "Then you should have no problem showing me. I will wait for Marshal Sloan, and I will allow an authorized court representative to inspect the case under proper procedure." Keller's jaw tightened. "You do not set the procedure here." A message sounded through his radio asking whether Justice Brooks had entered the building. Everyone nearby heard it. Keller reached up and lowered the volume. Adrian looked at the radio, then at the identification still in Keller's hand. "Officer Keller, you have my credentials, a court official confirming my identity, and a dispatch message using my name." His voice remained controlled, but the words carried across the marble lobby. What happens next will not be a failure of information. It will be a choice. Keller heard the warning, but pride had already made verification feel like surrender. He handed Adrian's identification to Emily without meeting her eyes, then pointed toward the screening table. "Set the briefcase down." Adrian complied. He placed the worn leather case on the table, stepped back, and kept both hands visible. "I will remain here until Marshal Sloan arrives," he said. "The sealed documents may be inspected by an authorized court representative." Keller looked around the lobby and saw employees, reporters, and visitors watching him. Instead of recognizing the moment as an opportunity to correct himself, he interpreted their attention as a challenge to his authority. "Open it now. I have explained the proper procedure. You are refusing a direct order." Emily moved closer. "He is not refusing security. He is protecting confidential court records, exactly as required. Keller turned toward her. Step away, Miss Carter. You know my name, you know his name, and you have both of our credentials. Keller ignored her. He reached toward the case, but Adrian raised one hand without touching him. Do not open sealed judicial material without authorization. The gesture was calm and measured. Keller treated it as defiance. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. A silence spread through the lobby so quickly that the soft hum of the lights became noticeable. Adrian studied Keller's face for a moment. Imagine standing inside the courthouse you had served for decades, beneath a promise of equal justice, while a man holding your identification chose suspicion over every fact in front of him. Adrian did not argue. He did not move toward the officer. He turned slowly and placed his hands behind him. Daniel, he said, looking toward the young law student near the screening line, keep recording. Daniel lifted the telephone higher. Keller secured the cuffs around Adrian's wrists. The metallic click traveled across the marble corridor. A reporter stopped writing. An elderly visitor lowered her eyes. Two security officers exchanged uncertain glances, but remained where they were. Keller stepped back as though the sound had settled the matter. The situation is under control, he announced. No one answered. As Keller moved the briefcase to the edge of the screening table, one brass latch caught against the metal frame and sprang open. Several documents slid onto the floor. The first page carried the seal of the Franklin Supreme Court and the title Judicial Security Review. Another page listed complaint summaries connected to courthouse personnel. Keller glanced down and saw his own name printed beneath a section marked Repeated Verification Failures. His expression changed, only for a second. Then he placed the papers back on the table and closed the cover. These documents are not relevant to this detention, he said. Adrian turned his head slightly. They are more relevant than you understand. The radio sounded again. Dispatch asked for confirmation that Associate Justice Adrian Brooks had arrived safely. Keller reached toward the volume control, but Emily stepped between him and the radio. Do not silence it again. From beyond the bronze doors came the sound of vehicles stopping outside, followed by footsteps and the low movement of a security detail entering the building. Daniel kept the camera steady. Adrian stood beneath the carved words "Equal Justice Under Law," his hands restrained, while Keller remained beside the open report bearing his name. The officer believed he had ended the argument. In reality, he had just turned every warning in the file into evidence. The bronze doors opened, and Governor Evelyn Whitmore entered with her security detail, legal advisors, and a line of reporters prepared to cover a carefully planned announcement. The governor had taken only 3 steps into the lobby when she saw Adrian standing beneath the courthouse inscription with his hands secured behind him. Her expression changed immediately. The practiced calm of a public official disappeared, replaced by the sharp focus of someone who understood that the morning had already become more important than any speech waiting upstairs. Who authorized this detention? She asked. The question moved through the corridor like a gavel striking wood. Keller straightened. Governor, this individual attempted to enter a restricted area with credentials that did not activate the elevator. Whitmore looked toward Emily, who held Adrian's official identification in one hand. Were his credentials verified? Yes, Emily said. I confirmed his identity. Dispatch called for him by name, and the access failure was caused by the overnight system update. Keller turned toward her. That does not explain his refusal to open the briefcase. Adrian spoke before Emily could answer. I agreed to remain at the screening station. I agreed to wait for authorized inspection. I refused only to let sealed court records be opened outside proper procedure. The governor's eyes moved to the documents resting on the table, then to the title visible beneath the courthouse seal. Judicial Security Review. Chief Marshal Rebecca Sloan entered from the west corridor and stopped when she saw the cuffs. She looked at Keller with an expression that carried both anger and recognition, as though the warning she had given him earlier had returned in its worst possible form. Remove them, Sloan ordered. Keller hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but Daniel's camera captured it. Sloan stepped closer. Officer Keller, remove the cuffs and surrender your access card pending review. Keller reached for the key. The locks opened, and Adrian brought his hands forward slowly. Faint red impressions marked his wrists, but he did not rub them or look for sympathy. He turned instead toward Daniel. Keep the original recording secure, he said. Do not edit it, do not post it, and do not send it anywhere except to the proper investigators. Daniel nodded. The instruction was calm, precise, and unmistakably judicial. Keller looked toward the governor. I was following procedure. Adrian faced him. Procedure required verification. Your assumption told you that verification was unnecessary. The lobby fell silent again. Governor Whitmore turned to Sloan. Preserve every camera recording, radio transmission, access log, and written report connected to this incident. Sloan acknowledged the order and instructed another officer to escort Keller away from the security station. Keller removed his courthouse access card and placed it in her hand. For the first time that morning, he had no command to give. Whitmore looked at Adrian. We can postpone the announcement. Adrian bent down and gathered the pages that had fallen from his briefcase. No, Governor. He placed the report back inside and secured the latch. The public came here to hear why reform is necessary. He looked across the lobby at the employees, officers, reporters, and visitors who had watched the encounter unfold. They have already seen the opening statement. The ceremonial chamber filled quickly, but the mood had changed. Reporters lined the rear wall. Courthouse employees occupied the side rows, and state officials sat beneath the carved seal of Franklin with none of the easy conversation that had filled the room earlier. Officer Grant Keller was no longer at the security station. Chief Marshal Rebecca Sloan had placed him on temporary administrative leave and ordered him to remain available for questioning. His badge was still his property, but his courthouse authority had been suspended before the ceremony began. Adrian placed the worn leather briefcase on the lectern and opened it carefully. Governor Evelyn Whitmore stood several feet behind him, while Emily Carter arranged the documents that had fallen in the lobby. Daniel Price sat in the first row with his telephone sealed inside an evidence pouch provided by a court investigator. The original recording had already been copied and logged. Adrian looked across the chamber. He could have begun with the cuffs. He could have described the humiliation, the ignored identification, or the moment Keller lowered the radio volume after hearing his name. Instead, he lifted the first page of the Judicial Security Review. For 18 months, he said, this court examined how security authority has been used in public courthouses across Franklin. His voice remained calm, but every person in the room listened as though testimony had begun. The review had started with complaints that appeared unrelated. A delivery driver held for nearly 40 minutes after presenting valid work orders. A grandmother removed from a public hallway while waiting for her grandson's hearing. A college student described as disruptive after asking why his identification had been rejected. Each event had been closed under a different phrase. Miscommunication, heightened concern, failure to cooperate. Adrian turned a page. Institutions often avoid seeing a pattern by giving every repeated act a different name. Chief Marshal Sloan lowered her eyes. She had read some of the complaints, but never all of them together. Adrian continued. Several incidents involved the same officer. In 5 reports, valid identification had been dismissed before verification. In 4, witnesses were not interviewed. In 3, audio from body cameras ended before the disputed exchange. No single complaint had been treated as proof of misconduct. Together, they showed a decision-making pattern that demanded independent review. Adrian did not say Keller's name immediately. He described the conduct first, allowing the room to understand that the issue was larger than the man standing outside it. Then he lifted a summary page. Officer Grant Keller appears in multiple incidents listed here. A quiet reaction passed through the chamber. Governor Whitmore looked toward Sloan. Were these complaints sent through your office? Sloan answered carefully. Some were reviewed through normal supervisory channels. Adrian closed one folder and opened another. They were processed. That is not the same as being examined. He read the repeated conclusions. Insufficient evidence. Reasonable officer concern. Citizen misunderstanding. Each phrase sounded harmless alone. Together, they formed a wall around accountability. Keller had believed the report on the lobby floor was irrelevant to his decision. Now everyone could see that his decision had become the clearest evidence in it. Adrian rested both hands on the lectern. What happened downstairs did not create this problem, he said. It revealed how long the problem had been waiting for someone important enough to be believed. The chamber remained silent after Adrian's final sentence, but the silence no longer protected anyone. It demanded an answer. Governor Evelyn Whitmore stepped toward the lectern and announced that the state attorney general would appoint an independent investigative team with full access to courthouse security records, personnel files, radio logs, and prior complaints connected to Officer Grant Keller. Chief Marshal Rebecca Sloan confirmed that Keller's administrative leave would remain in effect until the investigation was complete. She also stated that her own supervisory decisions would be reviewed, including every complaint that had passed through her office without a full witness interview. The admission cost her something, and everyone in the room could hear it. Adrian looked at the report, then at the faint marks still visible around his wrists. "Because I am now a witness in this matter, I will take no part in deciding Officer Keller's discipline," he said. "Accountability cannot depend on personal anger, even when that anger would be understandable." The governor nodded. "The investigation will remain separate from this court and from my office." That distinction mattered. Justice was not revenge with better language. It was a process strong enough to examine the powerful without becoming another instrument of power. Daniel Price was invited to describe how the recording had been preserved. He explained that the original file had not been edited, uploaded, or shared publicly. A court investigator had copied it, documented the time, and sealed the telephone as evidence. His voice trembled at first, but steadied when Adrian thanked him for remaining calm. "I almost lowered the phone," Daniel admitted. Everyone was watching, but no one was moving. Adrian answered from the lectern. Courage is often the decision not to look away. Outside the chamber, investigators met with Keller in a private conference room. They played the recording from the moment Adrian approached the elevator. Keller heard himself dismiss the credential. He heard Emily confirm the justice's identity. He heard dispatch call Adrian's name. Then he watched his own hand lower the radio volume. Without the urgency of the moment, his decisions sounded different. Clearer, smaller, harder to defend. "I believed I was protecting the building," he said when the recording ended. The lead investigator did not argue with him. "The question is whether you were protecting the building or protecting your first assumption." Back inside the chamber, Governor Whitmore committed state resources to locating every person who had filed a related complaint during the previous 5 years. Closed cases involving disputed identification, missing audio, or claims of noncompliance would be reviewed by outside counsel. Witnesses would receive written protection against retaliation, and the final findings would be released publicly except where privacy law required otherwise. Adrian closed the report. The consequences had begun, but he showed no triumph. A badge had not failed by itself. People had failed while wearing it, supervising it, and trusting it without question. This time, the record would not disappear behind harmless phrases. This time, every silence would have a name. By late afternoon, the rain had cleared, and warm sunlight entered the ceremonial chamber through the tall eastern windows, stretching across the marble floor in long bands of gold. The room was quieter now. Reporters had filed their first stories. Investigators had secured the recordings. Court employees who had watched the morning unfold sat with the uneasy understanding that silence had also been part of the record. At the front of the chamber, Governor Evelyn Whitmore stood beside a revised judicial reform order that had already been prepared for the day's announcement. Her legal team had added provisions requiring independent review of courthouse security complaints, mandatory preservation of camera footage, and public reporting on disciplinary outcomes. The order was ready for her signature. Associate Justice Adrian Brooks returned to the lectern with the worn leather briefcase resting beside him. The handcuffs had been sealed inside an evidence bag and removed from the room. He had refused to let them become a symbol of personal victory. They were not a trophy. They were proof of a decision that would now be examined without fear or favoritism. Daniel Price remained in the first row, his empty hands folded in his lap. Emily Carter sat nearby, still holding the morning schedule that had once seemed so important. Chief Marshal Rebecca Sloan stood at the side of the chamber, no longer directing the room, but listening to it. Governor Whitmore signed the order and placed the pen on the table. The applause began softly, then grew, but Adrian raised one hand. The sound faded. "Do not applaud because one mistake was exposed," he said. "Measure what changes after today." His voice carried without effort. "Ask whether every person who enters this building will be treated with the same patience that would be offered to a judge, a governor, or a senator. Ask whether an officer who receives new information is willing to reconsider an old assumption. Ask whether supervisors investigate patterns or simply rename them. He looked toward the bronze doors at the rear of the chamber. Earlier that morning, he had entered through those doors alone, dressed like any other professional carrying work into a public building. His title had existed then. His dignity had existed then. The truth had existed then. Only the recognition had been missing. This morning, many people respected me only after they learned who I was. Adrian continued. That is not the standard justice requires. The law is not measured by how it treats a man after learning his title. It is measured by how it treats him before knowing his name. Daniel lowered his eyes, remembering the moment Adrian had asked him to keep recording. Sloan looked toward the floor, remembering every complaint that had been processed without being understood. Governor Whitmore stood motionless beside the signed order, aware that promises would mean nothing without enforcement. Adrian closed the judicial security review and secured both brass latches of his father's briefcase. Justice did not arrive when the governor entered the building, he said. Justice was already standing in the hallway, waiting to see who would defend it before recognizing its face. Outside, the courthouse clock marked 5 o'clock, its bells carrying across downtown Franklin. A badge had given Grant Keller authority. His choices had revealed what he did with it, and the camera had preserved everything he refused to see.